This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. And the Florence County Museum, presenting Edward Gay, an American landscape painter, chronicling Gay's evolving style amid the turn of the 20th century and his unique connections to South Carolina and the National Academy of Design. Now through February 23rd, flocomuseum.org. And Meadow Garden, home of George Walton, one of the youngest signers of the Declaration of Independence. Open for tours Monday through Friday, 10 to 4. Learn more at historicmeadowgarden.org and visit augusta.com.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history, with a nod to all things Southern. Today, we'll be talking with Tracey Todd, the Director of Museums for the Historic Charleston Foundation, and Andrew Agha, an archaeologist working on the site of the Nathaniel Russell House, a National Historic Landmark on Meeting Street. We'll be talking about the Foundation's most recent preservation initiative, which involves the Kitchen House, an ancillary structure that included a kitchen, laundry, and living quarters for the enslaved.
Nathaniel Russell arrived in Charleston from Bristol, Rhode Island in 1765, and thanks to extensive contacts in his home colony, established himself as a successful merchant and trader of captive Africans. In 1808, the Russell family moved to their new town home at 51 Meeting Street. Accompanying them were as many as 18 enslaved people who toiled in the workyard, gardens, stable, kitchen, and laundry.
By uncovering the material history contained in the Kitchen House, the Foundation hopes to further illuminate the lives of the men, women, and children who lived and worked there. Tracey Todd, it's great to have you back on the Journal, and Andrew Agha, welcome. We Southerners got to find out, who are your folks? Where'd you come from and how'd you get here? Tracey, first with you.
Well, Walter, it's so great to be back with you, and I'm just grateful for this opportunity to talk about the Nathaniel Russell House in Charleston. But I originally came to Charleston from Conway, South Carolina, and I moved to Charleston to attend the College of Charleston and later the Citadel for graduate work. And as you know, we've been friends for quite a while, and I worked at Middleton Place for quite a long career, and I'm blessed for it. And now with Historic Charleston Foundation.
Okay. And Andrew?
I'm originally from Toledo, Ohio, moved south in the late 80s to a town outside of Savannah. Then we moved to Hilton Head, and I went to the College of Charleston to wrap up my undergraduate work. That's where I became an archaeologist in 1997. And maybe on the more interesting side, my father was an immigrant from Beirut. He came here in 1971, became an American in 75, met my mom in 75 in Toledo, and that's my peoples.
Okay, well, good. All right, we're here really to talk about the Nathaniel Russell House in Charleston, and a lot of Charlestonians know that. But even around the state, what is the Nathaniel Russell House, and why is it important?
Wow, that's a great question, Walter. It's a National Historic Landmark, for one thing. It's a house built in 1808 by a merchant in Charleston named Nathaniel Russell.
Who was not a native Charlestonian.
Who was from Bristol, Rhode Island. He had moved at age 27 around 1765. And really interesting, one of the first references we have is a letter that he wrote back to a friend in Rhode Island. And he said, I wonder why, I'm paraphrasing, why do I stay in this part of the country, in this city? He said, the summers are so almost intolerable. He said, but the kindness of the people is what induces me to tarry here. And I think about that quote that I really didn't do a great job of paraphrasing, but you get the idea. Hot summers, kind people.
And also in the 18th century, Charleston's natural increase was about the same as it was in Barbados. There were more deaths than there were births. So it was immigrants who built Charleston. Of course, the population of Charleston in the 18th century was majority African American, and they did not come as immigrants. But the white population, the increase in the white population was primarily by immigration, not by natural births. There were so many. The death rates here were the same that they were in Barbados. It was a very brutal place to live, unless you got through the first season, and then you were probably going to be okay. So Charleston wasn't also the most pleasant place. No paved streets, turkey buzzards clearing out the offal that was tossed out. So we now understand why this guy from Rhode Island might have written back and said, why am I staying here? Well, he stayed there because he could make money. And how did he make his money?
Well, he had connections from his family in Rhode Island. His father was a chief justice and had been also a silversmith, and his paternal grandfather was a merchant. So he brought connections with him, immediately.
So did he become a merchant, or did he specialize? I mean, where did he really make his money?
Oh, he made it as a merchant, as a factor, as an attorney for other people. He was really sort of a man about town doing many different things. But Nathaniel Russell, in addition to many different things he did occupying his business life, trading in enslaved people was one of those. And then later as an investor in property.
Well, because when he built the house, it was expensive even by Charleston standards. So he had made it financially.
And what's so fascinating about this story, Walter, and that I found fascinating since I came to Historic Charleston Foundation, is that he didn't build the house until he was 70 years old. So he had this entire life that he lived on the corner of East Bay and Longitude Lane, which is right beside Rainbow Row. If you're familiar with Charleston at all, he lived right there for the majority of his time in Charleston. And so he was in the middle of the hustle and bustle. He had coopers and blacksmiths living, sort of cheek by jowl with him, and that was common in that area of town in the late 18th century. So he lived there most of his life, and it was in his twilight years that he built this spectacular mansion that is, by many accounts considered one of, if not the finest, examples of federal architecture in America. That's why it's a National Historic Landmark, and it's so important. In addition to all the stories that it can tell about Nathaniel Russell, about the city of Charleston, about our nation, of course, all the people, our shared history there. One of the reasons why our friend Andrew is with us today is to talk about this wonderful archaeology, a program that we've had going in the cellar of the kitchen house that's teaching us so much about the African American community.
All right, some people may have unfairly say, well, Nathaniel Russell's house is just a nice, pretty house. But it's more than that. And houses can talk. Instead of being on display, they can tell a story. So, Andrew, let's talk about your kitchen project.
Sure. I was brought on to do the archaeology below the floorboards, which after, I guess, a chance discovery, people at Historic Charleston Foundation quickly learned that a lot of the original guts and nuts and bolts behind the modern walling and flooring of the kitchen building was actually original to the construction of it in relation to the mansion. Most of it dates back to probably 1808. And as a result of that, Historic Charleston and Nathaniel Russell House said, let's strip all of the new stuff, the 20th century stuff back, and let's see what it is. So the first archaeology actually took place stripping back the modern layers of the building and getting back to the original joists, the original beams, the original flooring. And then quickly learned work needs to be done to stabilize parts of the building, to prevent it from any further degradation, work on the original 1808 floorboards that if you go in there today, you can see those boards. You can stand on them.
How large is this building?
It's 36 by 18.
So it's a fairly large structure.
It's pretty big.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was split in the middle a central staircase and a door with a partition that separated the two sides. The west side, the left side, is the laundry space. The right side, the east side, is the kitchen, the working kitchen space. And then above, there were 3 rooms, dwelling spaces for the enslaved to live in. And so the staircase connected them to their workrooms downstairs.
And Walter, to sort of put this kitchen house into context, the house became a museum in 1955 when Historic Charleston Foundation purchased it, and that space had largely been untouched, and it was used for offices and retail space and different things by the foundation, with simply having modern wallboard put up over original walls. And in 2017, 2018, this sort of above-ground archaeology that Andrew is talking about began to happen. So if you're familiar with Charleston, many of these kitchen houses have been made over. Some of them are residences or different things, have different uses. So it's a really important, rare survivor of this domestic space that is so intact. And it's been a treasure trove through the years of learning through above-ground archaeology. And now, because of the need to restore the floors, we had to have the below-ground archaeology done in the cellar, not only to continue learning those stories, but to have access to the first floor so that it can be lifted and secured, and so that visitors can properly experience that space.
Is this kitchen house, would you say, one of the larger ones that's still in existence? It seemed pretty big when you described it to me. I mean, that's a good size.
No, I'm not sure I would say the largest, but it is quite large. It was a laundry.
There were smaller ones.
Sure.
Yeah.
If 18 by 36, you divide it in half, that's 9 by 18. It's still a fairly large space.
Yeah. And roughly half of the first floor was had a large hearth for laundry, and the other space had a large hearth and a beehive oven that was the main kitchen. And it's just been the work that's already been done is absolutely fascinating. And Andrew's continuing it on with his project.
You mentioned a cellar, and people might think, well, gosh, Charleston, a lot of high tide, but you're actually built on that core that runs the center of Charleston, so you're on the highest land. You could have a cellar.
Yeah, and so the archaeology, below the floorboards, under the crawl space, it served a lot of purposes. One, the soil needed to get removed to a certain depth in order for crews to go in to actually work on the flooring, check the stability of the brickwork, and then have the ability to get back in there to do maintenance-related things related to the house and its needs. Rather than take the soil out and just throw it out, previous archaeology, 2 inspections, small excavation units in the 1990s, and then a recent investigation in 2021 showed that the crawl space of 2 feet, you got to get on your hands and knees to crawl around in there, actually extends 3 feet below surface to 5 feet, a hard clay subsoil base. And so that's the same hard base that the mansion is built on. So in the past, enslaved people could walk around in there, maybe lower their heads, but through a formal arched brick entrance to the side of the building with probably masonry steps that led down. It was a very large space to not conduct activities because it would have been really dark, but to store equipment and supplies for the laundry. The cauldrons maybe lye for washing the clothes and other things stored there, but also maybe boxes, baskets, crates, what have you, to store root crops and other cold things and other supplies for the kitchen. So you said, how can you have a basement downtown Charleston? Well, the house is on the highest part of the lot. It's a very large piece of property. But as you move away from the Russell house, you start to get lower elevations. And lower elevations today, you walk in, it's the same ground level, but the subsoil drops down. And so water and groundwater is actually worse the further away you get from the mansion. And the inhabitants and the people and the enslaved that worked and worked in the kitchen and relied on it, they quickly learned that the cellar space that they'd created when they built the building in 1808 was going to flood probably pretty bad. In fact, during our excavations in September, we faced some flood water just from some heavy rains in the afternoon and a small hurricane that came through. We had to use a pump for about 2 weeks to make sure we had dry conditions.
So what did you find? Archaeologists love it. You got your screens. What about this bead that I read about?
Oh, so previous work had showed that there were layers of heavy trash, very large animal bone from past meals and food preparation, large ceramics, large pieces of glass, big pieces of metal, a lot of coal waste, and also brick rubble and some spoilers from buildings that have come down in the past. But because it's just 3, 5 by 5 foot squares in this larger kitchen, we didn't know if it was people coming in and dumping like basket loads of trash, creating piles. Until you get a bigger view and do more testing, you never really get to see how the archaeology site is put together. So one of the things we got a chance to do was see how did the trash get there, which was the main question that I got from almost every visitor. Why is there all this trash under there? Why are people doing this? And so what we learned quickly was that it's not piles of trash. It's not incidental episodes of trash being thrown in there. It's instead purposefully well planned out layers of certain kinds of trash periodically for maybe a 30 to 40 year time period, where it seems that they had a nice hard floor to work on, probably some boards down so that people could move around. And then the waters come in. They pull the boards out. They get some hard trash. If you put dirt down there, it's going to turn into mud, so you don't want to do that. They layered the trash down, pack it down, put the boards back. Water comes over and over until they wound up with crawling around on their hands and knees to get under there, and that's probably when they ceased using it as a cellar.
Well, that sounds like how most of the peninsula has been put together over the last 350 years.
Yes.
Remember the 1930s, Murray Boulevard, the city's dump. They cover up, a little bit of earth and sell these fancy lots. I mean, that's all over the peninsula. So
yeah.
You found bones.
The fancy stuff.
The fancy stuff.
The exciting finds.
Yes. But you haven't gone back to the bead.
Well, so...
Is that I've seen all this publicity about
yes.
the bead from the Nathaniel Russell house.
Yeah. So we're conducting lab work on the materials. Nearing completion. I have a hard time estimating exactly how much material we found. I'm guessing 10 to 20,000 artifacts. I'm not quite sure. We have
10 to 20,000 artifacts.
Yeah. That's just from the top 16 inches of the 3 feet that we had the chance to excavate. We could only go 16 inches due to architectural needs and limitations and the things. Things could compromise the integrity of the building if we dug too deep, so we stuck to 16 inches. So you can imagine if we had the chance to excavate all the way down, the trash goes all the way down 3 solid feet. So even cutting it in half, we have 10,000+ artifacts. Most of what we found are European ceramics, glass, bottles. There's some window glass, some architectural debris, and some other little interesting things like glass inkwells, some brass things that help hold doors together like hinges, brass doorknobs, spoons and cutlery and other things. And this one find of this carnelian bead is really the only object, one of the only objects that we found that we can identify that we could say this thing was actually not just worn by an enslaved African that was laboring in either the laundry or the kitchen or on the site, but it most likely was worn by them during the Middle Passage as they became enslaved when they were brought from West Africa. And so the person who wore this probably had this bead on them in West Africa.
Or what's the authority for that?
Yeah, so some carnelians come from different parts of the world. There's mines to get that material from up in the Northeast, it's near Seattle and Washington. There's a mine in Brazil. But at that time, some of those sources really weren't being used to create beads for people that would have them in Charleston. And the style of this bead, the way the stone is, the particularities of the stone, the way it's cut, it seems to be most likely a bead that originated in Cambay, India, where a major carnelian works was for a very long time. These beads are either rough cut there and then fire treated so that they get red and pink, or the raw stone is treated and then it's sent somewhere else to be cut. These beads have been found in West Africa. People still wear them there. And in North America and in the Caribbean, the only times we find beads of this particular nature are in African burials. In Barbados, there's probably another site or two, I can't recall right now, where beads were found on the person in the ground. There's other examples of carnelians, but in working with our former Charleston Museum archaeologist, Martha Zierden, who's my mentor and great friend from a very long time, she dug through all of her archives and said this is only one of 5 carnelians that has ever been recovered in about 50 years of archaeology in the city. And the other examples aren't like this one. They're of a different quality or different nature of carnelian gemstone, and that the one that we've recovered from the kitchen seems to fit more of the kinds that you'd find in burials or kind of the things that people are wearing while they're in West Africa.
Okay. Well, so how are you weaving that story into the interpretation of the Nathaniel Russell house?
Well, it will be woven in, Walter, this bead, literally being a treasured item of an enslaved person there in the house. And coincidentally, in the collections, there's a carnelian bracelet that after Nathaniel Russell's family sold the house, it was purchased by the RFW Alston family before and during the Civil War. One of his daughters had a carnelian bracelet. And to see that bracelet and have it side by side with this bead that was found below the laundry, it just is so tantalizing. The stories that we are going to be, that people are going to, not just we, people are going to be talking about and telling for years to come of enslaved agency. The stories that this bead holds, and also this sort of decorative element that this young Alston daughter is enjoying with her bracelet, and how their lives were different. And there's so many things. As our minds are swirling. But as Andrew said, he's still in the lab now, so the carnelian bead really hasn't come out to light yet, except for a few news stories, but it will be coming out.
Well, of course, my mind began thinking, you have a list of the enslaved persons on the property, right, of who they were?
Not so much with the names. We know the numbers of enslaved people at different times with the Russell family, and the clarity with names and more information about them comes later during the Alston occupation of the house in the 1850s and 60s.
So you don't have the wonderful reference sources that you had at Middleton Place, where you actually had names and occupations and potentially where they had come from in West Africa?
No. What we do have, and it really speaks to what Andrew said about this bead very likely coming on the transatlantic slave trade. Nathaniel Russell, in addition to many different things he did occupying his business life, trading in enslaved people was one of those. And he was known to be sort of savvy, you might say, business savvy. He really preferred selling these enslaved people who were directly from Africa. And how does that story relate to an actual piece, an artifact that is believed to have come with an African?
Like I've said on social media posts or whatnot, we'll probably never be able to put a name of a person on the bead or assign it to a person. It may not even have been worn by the same person while they were at the Russell House. It may have been passed around. It may have been just kept in a pocket. It might have been concealed from sight on a string of beads held under the clothes on their waist. But I think what's really neat about it is, like Tracey brought up, there's an Alston bracelet. And when you compare the stones of the bracelet to the bead we found, the quality of the stones, there's a slight similarity, but the finishing techniques on the stones are different. The Alston beads are round and tumbled, and they're small. This bead is rough cut. The facets are all irregular. There's a lot of wear and tear on the corners of the facets, and the hole is off-centered. But you get a chance to kind of see, the lives of the people in the space. It was rough. And you have to imagine these two gigantic fireplaces roaring all the time, how smoky the place was and the smells. And the Russell House is so large, it's producing laundry and food for so many people all the time. It had to have been a rough environment. And so I kind of like that this bead is a little rough around the edges.
Well, here we are again. You're talking about a hot workplace in a hot city.
Right, absolutely. And Walter, one of the things, in addition to the bead, which is so exciting because it's so rare and unusual, but other things that have been found that tell stories. And one of my favorite things that Andrew and I have been talking about is the pencil lead. It's these pieces of graphite. It's a little larger than what we would think of as a pencil lead today, but basically it's large pieces of pencil lead that he found quite a few of those under the laundry. And it's we believe that those pieces of pencil lead could have been used by an enslaved person, perhaps with a piece of slate to make a mark as a batch of laundry is done to mark it off. Mm-hmm. And how do these pieces tell us about these people's lives? Mm-hmm. And even the most insignificant thing like that has a story to tell.
Yeah.
And that's what we're here to do. We're here to tell stories. That's what historians really do. And it's great to be in partnership with a really great trained archaeologist and to be able to put that together.
We have a massive amount of European ceramics, Chinese ceramics, Cantonese export porcelain that Russell actually imported directly from the Canton region of China. It was the first direct from China imports to Charleston in the city's history. We have gobs of Cantonese porcelain. So we know a lot of these pieces were on the Russells' tables and in their rooms. A lot of the other ceramics, fancier things and more day use, tea wares and such, they're in the Russell House too. So the juxtaposition of the majority of the material being mansion trash and then these daily use objects like a bead or the graphite pencils that were most certainly used by the enslaved working in there. I imagine the white inhabitants and visitors of the house rarely visited these rooms. Maybe someone went in there to make sure things were going the way they planned. But the trash, by and large, represents the white inhabitants and visitors and guests of the mansion. But the daily objects that the enslaved used are in there too. And so we get a most unique chance to tell a really interesting story from the kitchen archaeology.
All right. But back in the mansion, and it's been years since I went through the Nathaniel Russell house, and then it was, I don't mean it critically, it was a beautiful house, and that's the furnishings and the architecture and that sort of thing. Not a whole lot of people stories. Are you changing that now, Tracey?
That is certainly what our goal is, and I think you would find it a different tour today than you found it years ago. And I really can't claim credit for that. It's been staff members at HCF, Historic Charleston Foundation, before me that have updated the tours through the years to the point where they are now. And now we're just excited about learning more and continuing to add more stories about people, because the days of someone, wanting to know the finite details of what sometimes derogatory called brown furniture, those days are sort of numbered, it seems, in our world. And what people want to know is, how are these stories being told about people, and how do they relate to me? And how can I find myself in these stories, and how do I find myself in this house? And our challenge is to have stories being told that relate to more people in the community.
Well, and I was not being critical of the way it was interpreted. I mean, I worked with Historic Columbia for years, but, back the way historic house museums were interpreted in the 70s, it's out of style. Hey, Mount Vernon has changed dramatically.
Yeah.
Monticello has changed dramatically. Mm-hmm. And it all involved around people stories. Mm-hmm. And so you've got Nathaniel Russell, you've got his wife. Her father was an important person, and that's a big part of Charleston's story.
Right. Right now, Walter, we're thinking about the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War coming up, and it's really upon us. And thinking about Russell, and this is before the house. He was not living at the house during the Revolution, and thinking about his life and his activities. We don't have a lot. Most of our correspondence relates to his business activity, so you don't have a lot of sort of personal thoughts. But he's always been interpreted as a loyalist merchant, because perhaps many of the merchants in Charleston leaned that direction, not all, of course. And he spent some time in England during the war. But one of our new initiatives is to sort of really unpack where was he? He did loan money to South Carolina in the beginning of the war. He did serve in the militia. He was appointed by Henry Lawrence as a United States attorney for South Carolina. And then the city was captured in 1780, and mysteriously in 1781, he left and went to England. And he came back in 1783, so he spent 2 years in England. And for that reason, he's sort of been interpreted as a loyalist merchant. But when you take a closer look at it, you see that he wasn't punished when he came back. He did stay aboard a ship for 4 months, but that was...
But see, that would be important as to whether or not, if he appeared on the list from the Jackson Borough Assembly, they went after the bad guys, and then, as we know, every time the legislature met in succeeding years, they took people off the list or reduced their penalty.
Right. And when he came back in September of 1783, he was forced, you could say. I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but he was on board ship for 4 months until this assembly met in that December. And as soon as they met, he was released. And as Andrew and I have talked about this, he immediately went right back to work. In January, he's back to work, as a factor for merchants importing goods. So his life went on very quickly after he returned from England. And it was almost like not even a skip of the heartbeat.
So did he figure into anything in the 1790s when basically the working class Charlestonians were the anti-Marine Britannic group? There were riots in the streets of Charleston against a lot of merchants because of the economic downturn. Does he figure into any of that?
Well, there's a period of time in the 1790s that our correspondence is kind of thin there, but he's living right on the corner of East Bay and Longitude Lane in the middle of this sort of mixed working class area of Charleston through that time.
You say that was common, and I understand that, but in the 18th century, merchants like Robert Pringle and Henry Lawrence moved away from East Bay.
And he moved away, but it was just a little bit later.
But see, that to me is an interesting. That says a lot about class as well as as finances. So maybe he really did make his big money after the Revolution.
Well, he married in 1788 at age 50,
Okay.
He married a lady, Sarah Hopton, who had quite her own fortune. So much so that they created a prenup of sort that allowed her.
See, that's an incredible. Do you interpret that?
Absolutely.
Okay, I mean that's
Isn't it?
well.
It's fascinating to think about a 50-year-old man and a 36-year-old woman marrying at that time, and then beginning their family. They had 2 daughters shortly afterwards.
Well, the fact that she was 36, that's very old in the 18th century to be having children. But they had a prenup, but the marriage settlements book is one of the oldest records in the state of South Carolina archives. And that was designed that fathers were going to make sure that no gold digger could get a hold of what he wanted to leave to his daughter. And unlike other places, particularly some other southern colonies who prided themselves, we had primogeniture and all of that mess. South Carolina fathers left all of their children something, and they always tried to make sure that their daughters were cared for and that somebody couldn't get their hands on the estate. So that's part of a bigger story, not just the fact of Miss Hopkins' family making sure that this interloper from Rhode Island somehow wanted.
Right. It's interesting that the arc of his life, and marrying at the age of 50, and then having these 2 daughters, and then at age 70, building this mansion house, and living in the house for 12 more years and dying at age 82. What an interesting arc of his life, and he was quite the citizen of Charleston. He was really a man about town, and he's listed in committee after committee of civic service. And he's really, the more I think about him and read about him and study him, he's kind of a product of both of his grandfathers, a merchant and a Puritan reverend, and then his father, a silversmith and a jurist and chief justice of Rhode Island. And he was very pious throughout his life. He was very industrious in the business community. He was very civic-minded throughout his entire life. And when you think about this image of him and trying to get to know him, there's still this issue sitting over here of being involved in the trade of enslaved people. And that's what's so fascinating, that this man with all these attributes, all these positive things, is that's the kind of person who's engaging in this activity.
It is a complicated story, but I do want to get back to the architecture of the house because it is a gem, and of course the staircase is, I would say, internationally famous. And why would that be, Andrew? Why is the stairway so famous?
Why is the stairway so famous? It's like an architectural marvel, I guess.
They call it a floating stairway?
Right. Yeah.
Built cantilevered.
It goes up 3 stories?
3 stories.
3 stories.
Yeah, 3 stories without support from the first floor to the second floor landing, and then from the second floor landing to the third floor landing.
Do you let visitors go up the stairs?
That's a great question, Walter. For many years, the tour of the house did include walking up the stairs. But several years ago, our preservation contractors coming into the house, Historic Charleston Foundation, realized that for the long-term preservation of that marvel of a staircase, we had to end that practice. So we don't. We look at it. We look at it from above and we look at it from below, but we don't use it anymore for tours. And I think when we are explaining that to our visitors, they get it. They understand.
Well, are there rooms on the second floor that are open to?
Oh, sure. The formal rooms are on the second floor. The drawing room, the withdrawing rooms.
So they basically go up the servant stair.
We have a back stair,
yes.
Right? Yes, absolutely. We have a back stair. Yep. Yeah, but even though it's not walked on, it's still very appreciated. I mean, it's a Charleston treasure.
I just asked that because it's 200 and some odd years old, and you just can't have hundreds of people walking up and down. I mean, it's amazing because it's been on display for more than 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And when you think about the house opening as a museum in 1955 and, perhaps on average 50,000 folks a year through there, it really wasn't built for that. We have to understand, it was built for...
The fact that it's still intact, that's a testament to its building.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And gentlemen, I hate to say this, but we need to begin to wrap up our time here. So maybe we ought to get to summarizing not only the wonderful archaeological work there at the Kitchen House, but just in general, how things are going to move forward with the Nathaniel Russell House Museum.
You brought up all the different stories, the complex characters that these people are that we were trying to work on creating new stories for and telling the full story. People want the whole story. The archaeology has been fascinating because we're getting a cross-cut of Russell, the things that he used, the things he owned. When you go into the Russell House and look at the dining room today, you see a period-style enameled Chinese porcelain set, but we're finding the actual pieces that he used on his own set, or on his table with his family. We're finding things that his wife probably used, and also recovering objects that his children probably used or took fancy in. We have lots of animals on ceramics. We're kind of going, I say, bunny crazy. There's bunny rabbits on various ceramics from both China and England, and so in getting to the stories and getting the people, all of the people at the Russell House in the past, bringing them to light and seeing what their daily lives were like. The archaeology of the kitchen has really been, it's going to show that. And I think we're all really excited to get a chance to put that on display and embellish the stories for visitors when they come.
Okay. And Tracey?
Yeah. Thank you, Walter. I think we're now in a phase where we're beginning to look at this new chapter of the Kitchen House and how does it fit in? What are all the stories that we can tell? If you were to go there now, you're going to walk on a sort of a catwalk. So it's a difficult kind of visitor experience. But our next step is to lift the floors on the first floor and to repair them such that people can actually experience that space. And that's sort of step one, and this continues. It's going to be years-long restoration and interpretation of the Kitchen House. But how does it fit into the complete story of the house? It doesn't stand alone. It doesn't live by itself. It's a part of the house, just like it was in the 18th century. And our goal is to make it a seamless part, make those stories seamless throughout. And so it's not segregated. You learn about these people here and these people here, but you learn about them all during the entire experience. And can I just say, Walter, before we sign off, the synergy at Historic Charleston Foundation, it's an organization that really is working towards the preservation of Charleston, and it wants to fulfill needs of Charleston through advocacy work, through preservation work outside of the museums, and through museums. We're helping to preserve historic African-American churches through the Sacred Places Initiative. We're working with everyday ordinary people who might live in a historic house through Common Cause Initiative. There's 400 easements that are on different historic houses in Charleston that Historic Charleston Foundation monitors. So it's quite a service that the foundation provides the city, and the museums are a complement to that and add great value to it because they are the living landmark of our identity in Charleston, I think. And so the synergy that all three of these bring together, advocacy, preservation, and museums, I think is so powerful.
All right. Tracey Todd and Andrew Agha, thanks so much for being with us today on The Journal. hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. Tracey Todd and Andrew Agha are just part of a team of folks at the Historic Charleston Foundation who work not only to preserve historic buildings and sites, but to support preservation efforts throughout the community. The stories that are literally being unearthed with the excavation of the kitchen house at the Nathaniel Russell House site are intriguing, and they will add much more to our understanding of lives of all of the people who lived and worked there in the early 19th century.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org as well as your favorite podcast provider. We'll talk again soon.